What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and for longtime viewers of this channel, you may know that I consider myself a pretty big Resident Evil fan. However, I was late to the Resident Evil party, therefore, and this is kind of embarrassing to admit, there were a few mainline Resident Evil games that I'd never actually played before. In anticipation of the upcoming Resident Evil 9 game in a few days, well, I mean, I made this decision a couple of months ago, obviously. I decided, hey, would be a great excuse for me to finally check those games off my backlog list. But of course, I can't just make it easy on myself and just play those games. I decided this would be a great excuse to just go ahead and replay/play all of the mainline Resident Evil games. So there's 12 games in total. It took me quite a while. It was quite a project. So without further ado, let's rock. A couple of points I want to make before we get into each individual game. I did, to the best of my ability, play these games in chronological order, starting with Resident Evil 0, and that's going to be the order that I'm going to talk about them in this particular video. I say the best of my ability just because there's a couple of games where I had to play them kind of at the same time. There's also that whole weird thing where 2 and 3 happen at the same time. I know that there's a way you can play like the first part of 3, then go back to 2, then play all of 3. I didn't do that. I just went in order. Now I'm going to touch on this as I go along in the video, but I played a majority of these games on my PC/my Steam Deck. My Steam Deck came in clutch during this marathon. I literally would not have gotten these games done in time for Resident Evil 9 if it hadn't been for my Steam Deck. So there was a couple of games where I couldn't play it on PC, most notably Code Veronica. I had to play that on my Xbox. So just because I didn't give myself enough time, I couldn't wait to just play Code Veronica on my Xbox when I had time. I also had to play Resident Evil 4 on my Steam Deck because I could play that wherever and whenever I had time. I literally think I played Resident Evil 2 while in a waiting room at a dentist's office, just because that's how my brain was this last 2 months. Was if I had a moment free, it was gonna be playing a Resident Evil game. I also want to point out that especially the early part of this franchise, most games either had an HD remaster or a full remake. That's the version that I played. If it had a remake, it had a remaster. That's the version I played. Like I just said, I played a majority of these games. I would say 75% of these games I played on my PC/Steam Deck. So whatever version is available on Steam, that's the version that I played. All right, with that out of the way, let's dive into this marathon. Starting with the first game in chronological order, Resident Evil 0. Resident Evil 0 follows STAR's Bravo team as they are dispatched to investigate murders, but unfortunately their helicopter crashes en route. While surveying the area, crash survivor Rebecca Chambers finds a broken down train owned by the pharmaceutical company Umbrella. While searching the train, not only does Rebecca find zombies, she also finds an escaped military convict named Billy Cohen. The duo decides to help each other escape the train that is again crawling with zombies. Out of nowhere, the train starts to move again, and the team must apply the brakes before the train speeds out of control. Once off the train, Rebecca and Billy discover a seemingly abandoned training facility. And despite considering myself a pretty big Resident Evil fan, one of the reasons why I was so excited to do this marathon was I kind of felt like a poser because there were a couple of Resident Evil mainline games that I'd never played before, and this is actually one of those games. This is the first time I'd ever played Resident Evil 0, and to be honest, I kind of had been avoiding it. Not because I don't like Resident Evil, like I said, I consider myself a pretty big fan, but because Resident Evil 0 has a reputation for being kind of old school with some of the mechanics. A lot of the early Resident Evil games have a reputation of being difficult to play because of these old school mechanics. And I heard that Resident Evil 0 was one of the games that was a little bit more difficult to play than others. And unfortunately, it turns out my fears were very much justified. So let's start with the biggest issue I had right off the rip, and that is the static camera. Now, stylistically, and I don't know if this is actually what they were intending when they developed the game, or if it's just me doing some mental gymnastics for a franchise that I really like, but stylistically, I like the idea of it being kind of like security footage, like you're watching security footage, and that's why the cameras are angled the way that they're angled. However, considering this is a video game and I have to physically play through it, in practice, the static camera drove me absolutely insane. Combat in this game becomes less about skill and more about guesswork. There are a lot of encounters that boil down to basically just me running away and then firing my gun into the abyss and kind of just crossing my fingers hoping that I was hitting something off screen. There are so many moments during combat in this game where I literally couldn't see the enemy. I could hear them off screen, which was great for the survival horror tension element of this game, which this game has a lot of that, which I of course appreciate. It's one of the things I love about this franchise. So that's all fine and good until you realize you still actually have to fight the thing that's closing in on you, even if you can't see it. And I'm going to touch on the partner system here in a little bit, but the partner system accidentally became really useful when it came to combat because, as it turns out, if you set your partner to attack, the moment that they raise their gun was basically your warning system that something nearby was hunting you, even if you couldn't see it, which is helpful for sure, but it's not the way that I want to play this game. The static camera also made something else pretty miserable for me, and that was picking up items. There were so many times where I would walk into a room, know that there was an item there, and then I would have to spend a solid 30 seconds just kind of, the best way I can describe it is humping a wall. You just kind of press yourself against the wall, smash that interact button, as I hope that you would smash the like button on this video. If that didn't work, I'd rotate the character slightly, try again, and hope for the best. And this is something that I'm going to talk about later on as well. This really clashed with my survival horror mindset. My instinct in these games is to always try to use the little ammo as possible. So when I know that there's an item in a room and there might be a few enemies, I kind of just want to do quick drive-by pickups in dangerous rooms and hopefully get out of that room without firing a shot. But because of the static camera in Resident Evil 0, that made it very difficult. There's literally a particular moment where you have to grab an item that's positioned behind a leechman. I'm going to talk more on them here in a little bit. And I had to try this particular section multiple times because I didn't want to kill the thing because they're so hard to kill. Again, we'll get to that here in a second. So I just wanted to go in the room, run past it as quickly as possible, grab the item, and get the hell out of there. But because the camera angle was not cooperating, I had to do this a couple of times. Speaking of the leechmen, they are easily one of my least favorite enemy types in this franchise. First of all, they're pretty scary to look at to begin with, which I like survival horror, so that's definitely a positive note, but they are super difficult to kill. You essentially have to kill them with Molotov cocktails, which I'm going to touch on the inventory management here in a second, but the game requires you essentially to always have Molotov cocktails, and you don't have that many inventory spaces to begin with, so it did become pretty cumbersome to always have to have Molotov cocktails with you. And now that I've played all of the Resident Evil mainline games, there are really two things in Resident Evil 0 that set it apart. One is the partner system. Apparently, according to the research that I did, this game was originally designed for Nintendo 64, and so they created the partner system to kind of take advantage of that system. Eventually, the N64 version did get scrapped, but they still kept the partner system intact. And I'd imagine in 2002, when this game originally released, the partner system was probably pretty cool. However, in 2026, it felt very outdated. I've played plenty of games that have done a similar system, but better. Again, I want to give them props for doing something a little bit different, but the actual moments where you need both characters to solve puzzles are pretty rudimentary and never really evolve as the game goes along. Now, I do want to give them props because the partner system does really help. Again, I already talked about with the combat, but it also helps with the inventory management system, since you can basically use the other character as a walking storage unit. So that certainly helps. But the biggest change that they tried in Resident Evil 0 that isn't in the other games is that there are no item boxes whatsoever. They did introduce item dropping, which is essentially if you're going to try to get through this game. And I definitely appreciate them trying something different. However, in practice, dropping items instead of using item boxes was an absolute nightmare. It created constant anxiety. Since this was my first time playing Resident Evil 0, I never knew when it was safe to drop something permanently. So you're constantly just dropping items near safe points and then backtracking when you need that item again. And hopefully you remember where you dropped it. I get that item boxes aren't perfect. And again, I appreciate that they were trying something different. But compared to dropping items and then having to backtrack when you want that item again, item boxes feel like heaven. And as a lot of Resident Evil games do, they leaned very heavily into loading screens designed as door opening animations. Now, I get it. This is a Resident Evil staple, but in this game, it feels excessive. And when you remember that about 60% of a Resident Evil game is just opening doors, it gets pretty annoying pretty quickly. And in 2026, thanks mostly to TikTok, my attention span is absolutely cooked. So watching the same door animation over and over again before I could even make it off the train got old fast. And using ink ribbons to save in 2026 is brutal. There's a section towards the very end of the game with this fork truck that I had to do multiple times because I saved way too early, didn't have any more ink ribbons, and I kind of locked myself into a bad situation. That's not necessarily the game's fault, but it's just one of those old school Resident Evil mechanics that I was glad to be done with after I got done with these first couple of games. Now, finally, the story. Despite being a prequel, I would say that it doesn't really add much to the overall Resident Evil lore, in my opinion. And unfortunately, the dialogue, even for Resident Evil standards, it's rough. Super cringy.
Billy. Lieutenant Cohen.
So, you seem to know me. Been fantasizing about me, have you?
You're the prisoner that was being transferred for execution. You were with those soldiers outside.
Oh, I see. You're with stars. Well, no offense, honey, but your kind doesn't seem to want me around, so I'm afraid our little chat time is over.
Wait! You're under arrest!
No thanks, Dollface. I've already worn handcuffs.
I could shoot, you know.
There are some interesting ideas here, but nothing that feels essential or particularly well executed with the story. So yeah, Resident Evil 0 is fascinating from a historical perspective. As a so-called Resident Evil fan, I'm glad that I could finally check it off my list of games to play, but playing it in 2026 is definitely a test of patience. There are some ideas here that I respect, but very few that I actually enjoyed interacting with moment to moment. As part of the overall series, it's an important stop, but it also reminded me why the franchise eventually moved on from a lot of these mechanics. And by the end of it, I was really looking forward to moving on to the next game. Moving on to the second game in my marathon is the game that started it all, Resident Evil 1. Now that Bravo team is missing following the helicopter crash from Resident Evil 0, Alpha team is dispatched to find out what happened. While searching the Arclay forest, the team is attacked by a pack of Cerberus. The 4 team members who survived the attack, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and the Alpha team captain, Albert Wesker, take refuge in the Spencer mansion that, surprise, is infested with zombies. While technically Resident Evil 1 isn't the first survival horror game ever, the devs were actually inspired by the limitations of the 1989 horror game Sweet Home, but this game 1996's Resident Evil is the game that literally defined the genre and was the first game dubbed survival horror. But my history with this game is complicated. When the original dropped in 1996, I rented it from Blockbuster, where it kind of tells you how old I am, played it for a few hours, could not wrap my head around the tank controls, and returned it the next day. Also, if we're being real, I was way too young to be playing this game. That Cerberus crashing through that window, that was childhood trauma for me. And as I was playing this game, I genuinely wondered constantly if Kid Me could have emotionally survived finishing this game, even if I had mastered the controls. The wild thing is, as much as I consider myself a huge Resident Evil fan, I didn't actually beat the first Resident Evil game until years later with the HD remake. I'm pretty sure I beat Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 before ever finishing the original Resident Evil. And technically, I've still never beaten the original PS1 version. This remake, though, is special. At the start, you choose between Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. Chris has more health, handles heavy weapons better, and starts with a lighter for certain puzzles. Jill has more inventory slots and starts with a lockpick, which means she can bypass several locked doors that Chris needs keys for. Therefore, Jill is definitely considered the more beginner-friendly route if you've never played this game before. Each character also gets a partner. Chris teams up with our good friend from Resident Evil 0, Rebecca Chambers, and Jill teams up with Barry Burton, somebody that we will pilot in a later game in this marathon. And depending on your actions, these partners can live or die. There are multiple endings based on who you save and whether you escape together. Nowadays, that type of branching story structure is not that big of a deal, but I'd imagine in 1996 it was huge at the time. Both characters start with just a survival knife and a Beretta, and this is where the game establishes one of survival horror's defining rules: ammo is scarce. Every bullet matters. You don't clear rooms for fun, you survive them. Visually, this remake still holds up incredibly well for being over 20 years old. The pre-rendered backgrounds, which this franchise will get away from later on, are gorgeous. The Spencer Mansion is beautifully creepy. Even without the zombies, I don't think I would want to spend 1 second in that house just based on the decoration and the overall vibe. The atmosphere is thick. It feels isolating, oppressive, and dangerous. Yes, I did complain about the fixed camera angles in Resident Evil 0, and they are back for this particular game as well, which is still frustrating. There's one puzzle in Resident Evil 1 with moving walls and a statue where I felt like I was fighting 6 different camera angles more than solving the actual puzzle. But maybe it's just because I got used to it, and maybe it was just because I played Resident Evil 1 right after I played Resident Evil 0, but the camera angles felt smooth in this one, which is not something I expected to say. Again, maybe it was just because I've gotten used to it, but it didn't feel as cumbersome as it did in Resident Evil 0. Speaking of Resident Evil 0, can we talk about item boxes? After Resident Evil 0 ditched them and forced so much unnecessary backtracking, seeing that magical item box again felt like coming home. Being able to stash items is such a core survival horror mechanic. It was refreshing that I had it back again. Now, I will admit there were a few moments where I wish I could have temporarily dropped something to pick up a nearby item, but that's a minor complaint. If I had to choose between having the ability to drop items without discarding them or not having item boxes at all, I would definitely choose having item boxes. Dropping items isn't inherently bad. I do think it was kind of a cool idea. It just wasn't worth getting rid of item boxes entirely. Like I said, I have played this game before, and I was surprised to see that the boss fights were interesting this time around. I remember them being way harder when I first played it years ago. There are a couple of bosses that can poison you, so maybe I just got unlucky back then, but this run, I felt like I kind of breezed through the boss fights. The real game changer in this game versus the rest of the franchise that made this game a lot harder is the Crimson Heads. So if you've never played this game before, what are you doing? Stop this video right now, go play it, come back to this video after you're done. But if you've never played this game, if you kill a zombie and you don't burn the body, it can come back as a Crimson Head, which is basically a faster, stronger, and way more aggressive zombie. And let me tell you, fighting one sucks. In survival horror, and this is going to be a theme throughout this video, I already tend to avoid killing zombies unless absolutely necessary because ammo is precious. With Crimson Heads in the mix, I definitely didn't want to drop a zombie unless I knew I could burn it, which just means there's an extra layer of strategy. Not only did I have to decide, do I want to spend the ammo, but I also had to consider, do I have the fuel to burn it? Is it worth creating a Crimson Head that I'm going to have to avoid later? And finally, let's talk about the story. And this is going to be something that's going to come up a lot in this video. And I don't say this in a negative way. I consider myself a very big Resident Evil fan. But let's be real, the stories are pretty silly. And that's the case with Resident Evil 1. Its story is silly, it's melodramatic, it's full of ridiculous twists and over-the-top villainy. There's a lot of James Bond mustache twirling in this franchise, and that's no different with Resident Evil 1. But that's part of Resident Evil's charm. I like the cheesy, goofy stories. And I didn't particularly love Resident Evil 0's story, so this felt like a breath of fresh air for me. It kind of checked all the boxes of a Resident Evil game, which should come as no surprise because this is the game that created the boxes, but it had everything I wanted from this game. It had a creepy mansion, it had bioweapons, it had corporate corruption, check, check, check. And at the end of the day, this remake is survival horror at its purest. It had tight resource management, an impressive atmosphere, meaningful choices. It's literally the blueprint for survival horror. And replaying it in 2026 at the beginning of this marathon, I'm reminded why I love this genre so much and why this franchise has endured for decades. So the third game in my marathon is the Resident Evil 2 Remake, which of course follows rookie cop Leon S. Kennedy and college student Claire Redfield, sister of RE1 protagonist Chris Redfield, who agree to meet up at the RPD building after being separated following a car accident. As is the case in Resident Evil games, the police building, as well as seemingly all of Raccoon City, is infested with zombies. Claire runs into a young girl named Sherry who is being stalked by a freaky looking monster who happens to be her dad, William Birkin, while Leon meets Ada Wong and agrees to help her track down the G-Virus. And as much as I respect the classics, after playing Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil back to back, it was honestly such a relief to jump into a modern remake. I love what those early games did for the survival horror genre as a whole, but going from fixed camera angles and tank controls to this was a huge sigh of relief. I finally felt like I was fighting zombies again, not zombies and bad camera angles at the same time. It's been about a year since I've played this game, and it just happens that the last time I played it, I did Claire A and Leon B. So this time around, I played Leon A and Claire B. And I don't have any scientific data to back this up, but the zombies feel smarter in this game versus the previous two entries. They're slow for sure, but they stagger, they shift their gait, they make you miss if you're not patient, and because ammo is limited, you're basically forced to aim for the head. Unfortunately, these zombies are bullet sponges. You can dump rounds into their torso and they'll just keep coming, but when you line it up just right and pop that critical headshot, when that head explodes, it's so satisfying. That never gets old. However, there is an adaptive difficulty where if you get too good or you have too many resources, the game will adjust the difficulty to knock you back down. Therefore, patience is the key. However, it's hard to be patient when you have Mr. X breathing down your throat. Speaking of Mr. X, let's get the big guy out of the way. Again, it's been about a year since the last time I played this. However, I completely forgot how stressful his constant pursuit is. I watch a lot of horror movies. It's kind of my thing. And I've always said the more you see a monster, the less power it has. You get a lot of diminishing returns in horror, especially survival horror video games. Eventually, you just get desensitized to whatever monster that's pursuing you. Doesn't seem that's the case with Mr. X. He still scares the shit out of me. Now, the RPD is designed with a lot of these interconnecting loops, so if you stay calm and think ahead and know your way around, you can avoid him, but that's the key, staying calm. It's very, very easy to panic, take a wrong turn, and suddenly realize you've trapped yourself in a hallway and your only exit is blocked by Mr. X. However, even when you manage to put distance between you and him, you can always still hear those heavy echoing footsteps, just thud, 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 always reminding you that he's still out there pursuing you. There are even certain rooms in the RPD that kind of give me PTSD. The first time I walked into the weapons locker in this run, my whole body tensed up, because the first time I played this game, I got stuck in that room while Mr. X was chasing me, and I was just running in circles trying to unlock the lockers, panicking, completely crashing out. So even years later, just walking into the weapons locker without him present still triggers that memory. Now, there are rooms that he can't enter, like safe rooms and certain quest rooms, which, to be honest with you, do break the immersion a little bit. He's this unstoppable force, except for when he politely stops at the door. It's kind of weird because he follows you everywhere, and he saw you walk into this room. Why would he just stop? So it does break your immersion, but I understand it's a video game and there's certain quest rooms where you have to do puzzles and the game has to give you time to do those puzzles. So I totally understand that. And to be honest with you, I'll take the breather. There are stretches in this game where you don't see him much and you really need that time to catch your breath. Luckily, I've played this game enough to know not to trigger him until the last possible second. I've definitely made that mistake before. In past playthroughs, I've triggered him super early and basically ruined that run because I was just constantly running away from him the entire game. Unfortunately, in the B storyline, he does show up earlier, whether you're ready or not. Speaking of the B scenario, I love the concept, seeing events from other characters' perspective, filling in the gaps of the story. It's such a cool idea. But if I'm being honest, the beginning of the second run feels a little too similar. I'm always feeling like, didn't I just do this? Now, to give them credit, the middle portion does enough differently to justify the two different playthroughs, but that opening stretch does feel a little samey to me. And I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of the Sherry section. It's brief, so it's certainly not a deal breaker, but it's one of those segments that definitely slows down the momentum for me. It's very similar to the Ashley section in RE4. Necessary for the story, just not my favorite thing to replay. However, I will give credit where credit's due. Claire does get the best guns. And at its core, Resident Evil 2 is survival horror at its best. A lot of that has to do with the visuals. Now, I really liked Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1. They held up better than I expected graphically, but this remake is just on a completely different level. It's absolutely gorgeous. The lighting, the gore, the character models, it all adds to that tense atmosphere inside the RPD, and it checks all the boxes of survival horror: scarce resources, exploration, of course, a lot of tension, but the boss fights also scratch that third-person shooter itch. Some of the boss fights are great, others not so much. I completely forgot how annoying that crane boss fight is. It's more tedious than challenging, which are the worst types of boss fights. But one thing that I really love about this game and the franchise as a whole, I'm a big fan of Metroidvanias. And while I wouldn't necessarily consider these games Metroidvanias, it does have a bit of that DNA in it. You're constantly finding keys or items that allow you to unlock certain doors. So you're constantly looping back to areas that you couldn't get through before. And there's a ton of that in RE2 Remake. And compared to RE1 and especially RE0, the backtracking here feels way less tedious. It's streamlined without losing that interconnected design. And I just really love exploring in this game, even though I've played it a few times. And one thing that makes that exploring a lot easier is the seamless map system in this game. I have a very bad habit of constantly checking my map in video games. My wife makes fun of me. She always says that I could get lost in the city I live in. So I'm definitely going to get lost in a video game police station, especially one that has so many loops to it. So the map is always going to be my best friend. But the thing I absolutely adore with this particular map is when the rooms go from red to blue once you found everything. It's genius. It keeps me from wasting time dry humping walls, hoping there's an interactable item I missed before. And because of all of that, at the end of the day, this is one of the best remakes Capcom has ever done. It modernized the formula of what a Resident Evil game is without losing what made the original special. It's tense, it's brutal, it's replayable, and somehow, even after multiple playthroughs, Mr. X still has me sweating. A quick break before we dive deeper into this Resident Evil marathon. While for the most part, I have no issue with these big gaming YouTube channels, I watch a lot of their content as well. They do have like a big team to make these videos. They usually have somebody writing the videos, playing the games, producing it, so on and so forth. Here at Patty McNinja, I'm literally Patty McNinja. Everything about these videos, good or bad, is done by me completely on my own. So this project was huge for me. I've already mentioned a couple of times that basically any free time I had was working on this video, whether it was playing the games themselves, which obviously was the biggest part of it, writing the scripts, producing the video, all that stuff. It was all me. So if you've made it this far in the video, you obviously are enjoying it to a certain extent. At least do me the favor of smashing that like button, as the kids say. Just a quick and easy way to tell YouTube that you're enjoying this content and they should push it to other people. But if you especially enjoy it, definitely consider subscribing if you haven't already. If you do subscribe, ding that bell. All right, with that out of the way, let's get back to the marathon. Moving on to the fourth game in my Resident Evil marathon, the Resident Evil 3 Remake. Thanks to the outbreak of the T-virus, most of Raccoon City's citizens have been turned into flesh-eating zombies. Pharmaceutical company Umbrella, looking to cover their tracks following the Spencer Mansion incident, used the outbreak as an excuse to test their newest intelligent bioweapon, aka Nemesis, to track down and eliminate all surviving STARS members, including our protagonist, Jill Valentine. And this remake, of course, is the follow-up to the globally loved 2019 remake of Resident Evil 2. And man, these remakes couldn't be further from each other as far as public opinion is concerned. The Resident Evil 3 remake has a very bad reputation in the community. And like I said, you mostly play as Jill Valentine with this remake, with a few short segments as Carlos Oliveira, a member of Umbrella's Biohazard countermeasure service. And right off the rip, I will say this, and this is not going to be a popular opinion, but I actually really enjoy this game. This remake gets a ton of shit from the Resident Evil community. Some of it's earned for sure, but I do think that most of the backlash comes from one of two things. First, this game gets compared a lot to the Resident Evil 2 remake, which again was universally loved, myself included. I have not met anyone that has played that game, the Resident Evil 2 remake, that hasn't loved it. So comparing RE2 Remake to RE3 Remake, it's not, as much as I do enjoy this game, it's not even close. The RE2 Remake is going to win that battle every single time. Or two, there is a lot of content from the original game that the RE3 remake was remaking that unfortunately was cut. But as I've said before, I was late to the Resident Evil party, so I never played the original RE3. So honestly, the cut content never bothered me because I didn't have that nostalgia for it. I had no frame of reference of what to expect when it came to the RE3 remake. Speaking of cut content, I do think that we need to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is Resident Evil Resistance. This remake, to kind of make up for the fact that a lot of content was cut from the original game, was bundled with an asymmetric online survival horror game called Resident Evil Resistance, where 4 survivors face off against one mastermind. I never played it. It's really not my jam. I don't particularly like these online horror games, but critics and RE fans absolutely destroyed this game. There was a ton of complaints about balancing, technical issues, and lack of dedicated servers. And to make matters worse, support ended just a few months after it launched in 2020. Now, technically, you can still play Resident Evil Resistance, but if you check SteamDB like I did while I was writing this, you will only see a couple of dozen players online. So if you do decide to play this game, which it doesn't sound like you should, you're going to make a lot of close friends because you're probably going to be playing the same people over and over again. Bundling Resident Evil Resistance to make up for the cut content really hurt RE3 Remake's perception among Resident Evil fans. They cut something from the original only to replace it with something that was barely playable a few months after the game dropped. So I totally get OG RE fans' animosity towards this remake, even if I don't share their anger. But enough about Resident Evil Resistance. That's not what this is about. Let's talk about the actual Resident Evil remake. And now that I've played all the mainline Resident Evil games, this is easily the shortest one. If you're a veteran to this franchise or survival horror in general, you can beat this in a long afternoon. Handful of hours tops, no problem. Side note, it was one of the rare games in this marathon that I didn't play on my PC or Steam Deck this time around. I actually bought this game when it first came out for PlayStation 4. And yeah, Steam is still charging $40 today for a 6-year-old game that's really short, which I found was wild. Yes, Capcom is currently having a sale as I'm recording this, but I still think this game is like $5. And of course, I already own it on PS4, so I just wasn't going to spend that money. But I'd imagine, like all of these games, it runs just fine on PC and or Steam Deck. But I actually think it being short is to the game's advantage. Because now that I've played this game a few times, it feels absolutely jam-packed with really cool stuff. You're never far away from something cool happening. Either it's a memorable boss fight, a really cool set piece, a shift in perspective. There's almost no downtime to Resident Evil 3 Remake. And I really appreciate that this game gives you both sides of the Resident Evil coin. Jail sections absolutely check that survival horror box the franchise is known for. Tight resources, tense exploration, that creepy dread of always being stalked. We'll get to Nemesis here in a second. Meanwhile, Carlos's sections feel much more like a third-person shooter, closer to some of the later games that we're going to talk about in this marathon, especially his hospital defense segment, where you're literally barricading yourself and holding off waves of infected. It's very action-heavy, and it works as a nice change of pace. But let's talk about Jill for a second, because obviously she is the main character of the Resident Evil 3 Remake. The opening sequence is done in first person, and it does show that she's dealing with PTSD from the events of the first game. It's a cool character touch that grounds everything before the chaos starts. But once things get moving, she's an absolute badass. She does not take shit from anybody. I really love that about her character. She does have some campy one-liners. She's not quite to the level of Leon and Resident Evil 4 levels of cheese, but they're there. And I love that about Resident Evil, that it is survival horror. It does have some really serious moments, but it never fully abandons that B-movie energy. Story-wise, I also love how this interconnects with Resident Evil 2. Technically, the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3 are happening at the same time. So it feels like if you play this game right after you just played Resident Evil 2 Remake like I did, you're really supposed to play Resident Evil 3's Remake for the first hour, then play all of 2, then go back to 3, but I wasn't going to do all of that. But like I said, if you play this game right after 2, it kind of fills in some gaps from that story. In Resident Evil 3 Remake, you interact with the gun store owner, which makes the letter she leaves for Kendo that Leon finds in Resident Evil 2 Remake make way more sense. You also get to see how Marvin gets infected in this game. It makes the Raccoon City incident feel more cohesive, like events aren't just happening in a vacuum. All right, so I've mentioned Nemesis a couple of times. Let's go ahead and get him out of the way. As cool as he looks, because I do think he looks really badass in this game, unfortunately, he's not quite the looming dynamic threat that Mr. X was in Resident Evil 2 Remake. I talked about him for a good chunk of our discussion about that game. Unfortunately, Nemesis, his appearances feel more scripted and predictable. If you've played this game once or twice, you know exactly when you're going to get your Nemesis. But I still think he's a cool antagonist. When he shows up, things escalate fast. He also forces you to engage with the dodge mechanic, which, if I'm being honest, has always felt a little off to me timing-wise. When it works, it feels awesome. When it doesn't, it's frustrating. And it's especially frustrating in a survival horror game when something the game is kind of forcing you to use doesn't always work right. From a technical standpoint, Resident Evil 3 Remake is a modern remake through and through. It was developed concurrently with the Resident Evil 2 Remake, and both were developed on Capcom's RE engine. When I originally played it, when it first got released on PS4, it already looked fantastic, but with the most recent free PS5 upgrade, it looks even better. The lighting, character models, performance, it's all top tier. And I personally, obviously I'm more positive about this game than most people, but I do think the replayability is solid, mostly because it's so short and it's jam-packed with a lot of cool stuff. And as you do in a lot of other Resident Evil games, you actually earn points to unlock items and modifiers for future runs. And I'll be honest with you, after this most recent playthrough, I earned a decent chunk of CP that I seriously considered running it back immediately with some bonus items. But then I had to remind myself, I'm not even halfway through this marathon and time's a ticking. So I showed some restraint, but I'm definitely gonna replay this again soon. So ultimately, where do I land on the Resident Evil 3 remake? Well, of course, I'm more positive than most, but even I can admit, is this peak Resident Evil? No, not even close. But is it a fun, polished, tightly paced action horror game with some genuinely great moments? Absolutely. If you go in expecting what you got from the Resident Evil 2 remake, especially if you played the original Resident Evil 3, you're most likely gonna walk away disappointed in this game. But if you treat it as a compact, high energy side story that complements Resident Evil 2 and lets Jill Valentine shine, I do think that there's a lot to enjoy here. So we are officially on game number 5 in this Resident Evil marathon, and we are talking about Resident Evil Code Veronica. Code Veronica follows Claire Redfield still in search of her brother Chris, who raids an Umbrella facility in Paris. The caper fails and she's imprisoned on Rockfort Island, a prison complex owned by Umbrella. In true Resident Evil fashion, Claire awakens to a guard letting her out of her cell because a T-virus has infected the island. So this is actually the first game since I played Resident Evil 0 that I hadn't played the game prior to this marathon. It originally dropped on the Sega Dreamcast back in 2000, and unlike the earlier games, it didn't immediately land on Sony hardware. It took years before it hit the Nintendo GameCube, and even longer before it showed up on Xbox and PlayStation platforms. So yeah, I'd imagine Code Veronica is probably the mainline Resident Evil game that the least amount of fans, myself included, until now obviously, have actually played. And I'll be honest, I was a little nervous going into this one. I had just come off of back-to-back modern remakes with Resident Evil 2 and 3, and I was getting very comfortable with the modern controls, over the shoulder shooting, quality of life improvements, and so on and so forth. And now I'm diving back into a year 2000 survival horror game. I even did a YouTube short not too long ago talking about there was a rumor that we might get a Code Veronica remake announcement for the franchise's 30th anniversary. And I'll just start off this mini review by saying that a remake for Code Veronica would be great, and it certainly needs it for reasons we're about to get into, but that rumor doesn't really help me now because I'm playing the game right now. I did play the HD remaster version from the Xbox 360 era on my Series S, and let me tell you, those first couple hours were an absolute slog. I complained about the controls in Resident Evil 0, but compared to this, Resident Evil 0 felt like a dream. The tank controls in Code Veronica were driving me insane. Every hallway felt like a battle. Every zombie encounter felt clunkier than it needed to be because I was constantly fighting these controls. For fun, I decided to reenact my character walking down a hallway. I would say for the first at least 2 hours of playing this game, I had to keep repeating to myself, this is the last game like this, this is the last game like this. Now, structurally, the game is split between Claire Redfield and her brother Chris. The first half has you playing as Claire, who's been captured and thrown into this creepy prison facility, and the back half shifts to Chris as he searches for her. And I've got to say, I really appreciate how Claire was written in this game. Throw out the tank controls, a lot of this game is actually pretty good. She was already a badass in Resident Evil 2, but here you really see how much she's grown since Raccoon City. She just feels tougher, more confident, more capable. It actually feels like she's fighting back. The setting is classic Resident Evil in the best way possible, even though the first portion takes place in a prison, which is creepy as hell. You still get that gothic mansion vibe shortly after. And this was actually the first Resident Evil game to ditch the pre-rendered backgrounds in favor of a full 3D environment, thanks in large part to the Dreamcast's power. So yeah, not a ton of people played this game because the Dreamcast wasn't a popular console, but the game overall is better because of the Dreamcast. Because of the 3D environments, the camera is way more dynamic in this game. It pans, it follows, it zooms. It just feels more alive. And honestly, that was a welcome change from the earlier entries. I said this before, especially with Resident Evil 0. I was happy, especially with the tank controls, that I wasn't also fighting the camera angles as well. Visually, and I know I'm going to sound like a broken record here, and yes, I was playing the HD remaster, but for a game that came out in 2000, I expected it to look a whole lot worse than it did. It holds up surprisingly well, not modern remake well, but way better than a game from when I was still in junior high school probably has any right to look. The CGI cutscenes especially felt like the developers were trying to level up. The opening sequence would make some Hollywood action directors blush, and the little touches like the lighting effect from Claire's lighter might not seem like a lot today, but back then it probably felt revolutionary. Now we do need to talk about the voice acting. Yikes. Even by Resident Evil standards, this one is rough. And that's saying something because I've had some negative things to say about this franchise and the voice acting. Steve in particular, I don't know the direction the actor was given, but it was tough to listen to. His voice was like nails on the chalkboard to me. I'm not sure I would have liked the character anyways, but the performance did him zero favors.
Wait, don't shoot.
Who are you?
Huh? You're not a zombie. Well, great. Wait right there. I'm coming over. Sorry about that little misunderstanding, but I thought you were another one of those
Shut up. Make one wrong move and I'll shoot.
Relax, beautiful. I said I was sorry. My name's Steve. I was a prisoner on this island. And I'm guessing you're not from Umbrella either.
No, I'm Claire. Claire Redfield.
Claire? Nice. I'll remember that.
It honestly gives Resident Evil 0 a run for its money in cringy dialogue department. And the story, even for Resident Evil, this story is batshit crazy. We're talking full-on gothic melodrama meets soap opera meets Bates Motel levels of insanity. The villains chew the scenery so hard, I'm surprised they have any teeth left. It's just unhinged. That being said, it is entertaining in that classic Resident Evil way. All these stories are really silly. But we do have to talk about what might be the most frustrating boss fight in the entire franchise. You know how I complained about the crane fight in the RE2 remake? I would replay that fight 100 times before I would ever try to knock the tyrant off the plane again in Code Veronica. Tank controls plus a bullet sponge boss that hits like a tank, pun intended, in a tiny enclosed space. That was an absolutely miserable combo. It was one of the moments where I really could feel the age of this game in the worst possible way. And yet, despite the clunky controls, the frustrating boss fight, the rough voice acting, and the completely unhinged story, I really respect Code Veronica. That was a long list of complaints, but I do honestly respect Code Veronica. This is classic survival horror through and through. It's challenging. It demands you paying attention to resource management. It punishes mistakes and doesn't care if you're comfortable. Do I hope it gets remade? Absolutely. Not because it looks terrible. It actually holds up pretty well in that department, but because the core of this game deserves modern controls and pacing. There's a really strong foundation here. And at the end of the day, Code Veronica feels like a bridge between old school Resident Evil and the more action focused direction the series would eventually take. It's a little messy, it's a little frustrating at times, but it's also really ambitious, and it's undeniably an important piece of Resident Evil history. And for the marathon, and just for me being a big Resident Evil fan, I'm glad I finally crossed it off the list, even if I had to wrestle with the tank controls the entire time. That being said, this was the first time this marathon started to wear on me. We are almost halfway done with my Resident Evil marathon, on to game 6, which luckily for me kind of gave me a second win going into the second half of this marathon, because it's one of my favorite Resident Evil games of all time, and that is Resident Evil 4 Remake. This remake follows our favorite once rookie cop, now government agent Leon S. Kennedy, who is sent to a remote village in rural Spain to rescue the president's daughter, who has been kidnapped. Once he arrives, Leon finds that the entire village is infected with a brand new mind-controlling parasite, Las Plagas. And as I've said before, I was late to the Resident Evil party, but Resident Evil 4 was one of the rare entries where I had actually played the original back in the day. I should also point out, since this remake was released in 2023, which was kind of the early days of this channel, I actually did a full review of this remake when it first came out. So if you want to even deeper dive and see my thoughts immediately after its release, definitely check out that video. This is the game that completely shifted the franchise from survival horror into full-blown action adventure. It's also the first mainline game that wasn't centered around Umbrella, which was a massive change at the time. Fun fact, the original incarnation of Resident Evil 4 was eventually reworked into Devil May Cry, which honestly makes so much sense when you think about the stylish action DNA in this game. And here's the thing, out of all the modern Resident Evil remakes, this is the one that needed it the least. The original still holds up incredibly well, so the big question was, why remake it? Well, after replaying this remake, I can confidently say this isn't just a fresh coat of paint, but that fresh coat of paint is definitely there. Let's start with Leon. In the remake, they flesh out his backstory a lot more. We get a better understanding of why he went from rookie cop in Resident Evil 2 to full-blown government special forces badass here. They did tone down some of his cheese. It's definitely still there. He still has his famous one-liners. It's just refined in this game a little bit, which makes the jet ski conversation way less cringe. There's no weird sexual tension between Leon and Ashley anymore. They dialed way back. Luis isn't portrayed as a sexual predator in this game, which is a huge improvement.
Small world, eh? Well, I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics, too.
How rude! And I don't believe there's any relevance with my figure and my standing.
Speaking of Ashley, her and Leon have way more chemistry this time around. A lot of that can be contributed to the fact that while they're walking through the environments, they're constantly chatting to get to know each other. It makes their relationship feel way more natural instead of just some escort mission awkwardness that was in the original. Visually, this game looked incredible in 2023 when it first came out, and even though graphics have gotten better over the last few years, it still looks fantastic. The lighting, the atmosphere, the gore, because yes, while this leans way more into action than the previous entries in this marathon, Resident Evil 4 Remake is still gory as hell, which I love. Some of the character redesigns are amazing. Salazar looks incredible this time around. I wasn't a huge fan of him in the original. The wolves, on the other hand, still look kind of silly, which sucks because there's that huge maze section where you're basically just fighting wolves the whole time. Speaking of combat, I put almost 100 hours into this game back in 2023 when it first came around. And the first time around, the combat took a little bit getting used to, but replaying it now, it was like riding a bike. The knife parry into a headshot into a roundhouse kick combo still feels ridiculously smooth. I honestly forgot how clutch the knife is in this game. It does have limited durability, so you've got to keep an eye on that. But if you upgrade your main knife's durability, and you can repair it at the merchant if it breaks, and depending on your difficulty, you'll find plenty of knives. So I never felt really stressed about not having a knife. Those extra knives can also be crafted into bolts for the new weapon in the remake, the bolt thrower, which, to be honest with you, that became my go-to weapon because you can retrieve the bolts from enemies after you kill them, which allows you to save the heavy ammo for the tougher enemies, which becomes especially clutch later in the game when things get wild. I should also point out that they completely did away with the quick time events. They're completely gone, and honestly, thank you. We'll get to that in Resident Evil 6, but I'm not a big fan of QTEs. I also appreciated that the minecart ride is actually way more fun in the remake. I kind of hated that section in the original, so I'm glad that they redid it and made it a lot more fun. Inventory management, which has always been a love-hate relationship for me in this franchise, is still definitely here. And yes, it feels like I'm playing Tetris in this game. It's charming at first, and I totally understand that this is part of the franchise, but as much time as I put into this game, it definitely wears thin after a while. But now let's address the real pain with this game. I did not mean for that to rhyme. And let's start with Ashley's section. Much like playing as Sherry in Resident Evil 2 Remake, I'm just not a fan of these forced stealth-only segments. I will say I prefer Ashley's section to Sherry's, but both are moments where I kind of just grit my teeth and try to power through as quickly as possible. And this game is brutal with its pacing at one point. It stacks Ashley's section, then the bug enemies, then immediately throws you into the double Garrador fight. For me, having those three things back to back to back feels like cruel and unusual punishment. I love this game to death, but that stretch is just awful. The island section still feels tonally different from the rest of the game. It didn't quite fit in the original, and while the remake tries harder to blend it in, it still feels like you stepped in a completely different game. Not bad, but just different. But even despite those small nitpicks, at the end of the day, this is still the definitive way to play Resident Evil 4. It respects the original while modernizing what needed modernizing, because there was a few things I definitely appreciated that they changed in this remake. It deepens the characters, smooths out the rough edges, improves combat, and still keeps that slightly unhinged action horror energy that made the original iconic. And for me, this is easily top 3 Resident Evil games of all time. And if you've somehow not played it, either the original or the remake, which I have a hard time believing considering you're watching a hour-plus Resident Evil retrospective, you definitely need to change that because this is a phenomenal video game. Moving on from one game that I've played a ton of, the Resident Evil 4 Remake, to one that I've literally never played before this marathon, and that is Resident Evil Revelations. And honestly, I'm a little embarrassed I haven't played this sooner. Shortly after the events of Resident Evil 4, terrorist group Veltro launches an attack on the Mediterranean city of Terra Grigia using BOWs against the city. The Federal Bioterrorism Commission attempts to maintain control over the city, but is unsuccessful, leaving them no choice but to torch Terra Grigia in order to contain the BOWs. After BSAA agent Jill Valentine and her partner Parker investigate a possible resurgence of BOWs near the ruins of Terra Grigia, BSAA head Clive R. O'Brien reports that fellow agents Chris Redfield and his partner Jessica went missing while investigating rumors of Veltro's possible reappearance. The pair are sent to investigate their last known position, which is an abandoned ship called the Queen's Zenobia. Originally released in 2012 on the Nintendo DS, which it's not super surprising that I missed this game because I mostly used my 3DS back in the day to play Pokemon, so this definitely wouldn't have been on my radar. Now, Revelations later did get an HD port to pretty much everything. For this marathon, I played it on my PC and spent a good chunk of that time on my Steam Deck. On one hand, it wasn't surprising that I skipped this one considering it was on the 3DS, but it is a little bit more surprising on the other hand, because you do play as Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield, two of the most important protagonists in the franchise. You'd think alone would have made this a mandatory play for me years ago, but better late than never, I guess. Let's talk about the story first, and to be honest with you, it's fine. It's not bad, but it's also nothing I'm gonna write home about. Despite starring Jill and Chris, it still does kind of feel like a side story, not essential, not franchise altering, just an extra chapter in the bigger saga. However, what I did appreciate was the interesting story structure that this game had. Resident Evil Revelations is presented like a TV series. It's divided in 12 episodes, each about 30 to 40 minutes long. You get previously on recaps and next time on previews at the beginning and end of each chapter, which are very cool and makes it stand out from the overall franchise. That TV series style of storytelling is probably great if you play this game in short bursts. But since I was playing this for this overall marathon, I was playing big chunks at a time to get this game played in enough time to get this video out. Hearing the previously on Resident Evil Revelations over and over again did get a little old. I still respect the attempt to do something different. It did give the story a rhythm, and the episodic structure allowed for some fun, if not occasionally predictable twists. There are also a couple of side characters clearly meant for comic relief, and tonally, they just don't feel like they fit. But let's be honest, cheesy comedy is kind of baked into this franchise DNA at this point, so I'll forgive it. Where this game really shines is the atmosphere. Most of this campaign takes place on a massive, mostly abandoned cruise ship infested with BOWs, and let me tell you, this setting rules. It's not a mansion, but it absolutely captures that old school Resident Evil energy. The tight hallways, the creaking metal, the rusty, decaying shell of what used to be a luxury liner. It's claustrophobic and creepy as hell. The Jill sections especially lean hard into the survival horror. There's limited resources, tight spaces, slow tension building exploration. It genuinely felt like an old school Resident Evil game. The monster design is solid too. The enemies are creepy and varied enough to keep things interesting. However, by the end, I would have liked maybe one or two new enemy types just to shake things up, but overall, I never felt bored. On the other hand, the non-Jill sections, that's definitely where the tone shifts. When you're playing as other characters, including Chris and Parker, the game leans much more into third-person shooter territory. There are moments when you're literally just blasting through waves of hunters, and don't get me wrong, that's really fun, but it doesn't quite match the claustrophobic survival horror vibe of the ship exploration, and the tonal whiplash is noticeable. Gameplay-wise, there are a couple additions I really appreciated, especially playing 12 of these games back to back. First, this game has some small weapon upgrades. You find these custom parts scattered throughout the game that let you improve damage, firing rate, reload speed, and much more. It adds a very light RPG layer that feels satisfying without overcomplicating things. And then there's also this scanner called the Genesis, a device that allows you to scan enemies for health items and scan environments for hidden resources. It's a really cool idea, and early on I was using it constantly. But as the game went on, I found myself using it less and less. It's one of those mechanics that's neat in theory, but not something I relied on heavily, especially the last half of the game. There's also a raid mode that I wanted to mention, which is a separate action-focused mode where you replay condensed stages, level up characters, and collect better weapons. It's more of an arcade style run and gun, and because I was on this tight schedule trying to beat every mainline game before RE9 drops, I didn't get a chance to dive into the raid mode, so I can't tell you how I personally felt about it, but I absolutely plan to circle back to it later because I really enjoyed this game. Now let's talk about difficulty. Some of the boss battles in this game are no joke. In fact, one of the hardest bosses shows up very early on in the game, which is not usually how things go. You usually kind of ramp up to the harder bosses, but you get one really early on in this game, which was surprising. And the final boss, honestly, is one of the toughest I've faced in this entire franchise. It's not quite Code Veronica frustrating, but it definitely really tests your patience. And one of the things that really does test your patience in this game is Revelations also has a dodge mechanic similar to the Resident Evil 3 remake. And just like that remake, it doesn't always work when you need it to. It feels inconsistent, which meant I didn't fully trust it. And if I can't trust the dodge mechanic in a survival horror game, I'm probably not going to use it too much. Visually, this game isn't going to blow you away, especially if you're used to modern high-end PC gaming. But again, this started its life on the 3DS, and considering this was a 3DS port, I was genuinely impressed by how good it looked. It looked sharp enough in HD and ran beautifully on my Steam Deck. So where does Revelations land for me in this overall marathon? It's certainly not top tier Resident Evil. It's not redefining the franchise by any stretch of the imagination, but it absolutely surprised me how much I enjoyed this game. The ship setting, the return to claustrophobic horror, the episodic style of storytelling, it all added up to a really solid entry that I had way more fun than I expected going into it. Especially if you're a fan of Jill, or maybe a fan of old school horror vibes, or just someone who somehow skipped this one like I did originally, it's absolutely worth your time. All right, so we are officially on the home stretch of this marathon before RE9 drops. We are talking about, of course, Resident Evil 5, which follows Chris Redfield, who is dispatched to West Africa to apprehend terrorist Ricardo Irving. To help Chris navigate unfamiliar territory, he's partnered with Sheva Alomar, a BSAA agent assigned to the West African branch. When they arrive, they discover that the locals have been infected by the Las Plagas parasite. As we've discussed in this marathon with past entries, Resident Evil as a franchise has always kind of dabbled with this partner system. However, Resident Evil 5 doesn't just experiment with a partner system, it goes all in. This is a full-blown two-player experience. As player one, you play as Chris Redfield, but as I mentioned in the synopsis, you also play the entire game with Sheva Alomar, who is a brand new character to the franchise. And story-wise, since she's kind of there to help Chris navigate through territory he's unfamiliar with, I kind of dug that dynamic. It makes sense. Chris is the outsider, Sheva knows the land and can kind of help him out with that. And the first time I ever played this game back in the day, I actually co-opted with a buddy. He was Chris, I was Sheva. And honestly, that's the ideal way to experience this game. However, this time around, I was doing this marathon on my own, so I of course played it solo. And look, I don't want to pile on, because the AI partner system has been beaten to death for years. People have absolutely shredded Sheva's AI. So going into this replay, I was kind of dreading playing it solo. But here's the thing, it honestly wasn't that bad for about 75% of the game. She did some goofy stuff here and there, sure, but overall, it was manageable. However, the last stretch of this game, the difficulty spikes hard, and when you don't have a real life partner who actually has a brain who can carry their own weight, you certainly feel it, especially during the Wesker fights. There's a couple of Wesker boss fights towards the end of this game that not having an actual human partner really hurts. There were moments where Sheva wasn't just unhelpful, she actively made things harder. And the final act, it gave me flashbacks to the water room from the RE4 remake, that level of frustration. Now, mechanically, there were some smart decisions here. Quest items don't take up inventory space, which if you've played a lot of these games, you know that's not always the case, so that's a win. I've always had a love-hate relationship with the inventory management in this system, and we'll get to a little bit more of that here in a second. There is no merchant like in Resident Evil 4, but you can use currency between chapters to buy items and upgrade weapons, so it's definitely streamlined. It feels more efficient in this game, but I do like the merchant. I miss the merchant. It feels like a step back not having that personality in the world. And the inventory management, it's not quite the full-on Tetris puzzle of the RE4 remake, but having to stop mid-game to shuffle items between Chris and Sheva's inventory, it does feel like it kills the momentum. I also wish that there was an option just to use an item, not having to pick it up, assign it, then use it. That was kind of irritating. And this franchise was kind of slowly working its way to full-on action blockbuster. This is the game where they completely shift. RE5 fully commits to the third-person shooter. This is not survival horror at all. This is a zombie shooter, a full-on action blockbuster. The upside, however, is the increased pace makes it feel like a quicker playthrough. You're just constantly moving in this game. I'd imagine that makes it very replayable, especially if you got a buddy to smooth out the later sections. The downside is survival horror is what this franchise is known for. That's how they made their name. And the horror tension that defined this franchise is essentially gone. To make matters worse, puzzles, which are another defining aspect of this franchise, are in Resident Evil 5, but they're super simple and very sparse. And it certainly doesn't help that this game came out in 2009 and you can't walk and shoot. Apparently, according to what I've read, that was a design choice to increase the tension. And if that's true, it's a big swing and a miss from the development team. It didn't increase tension, it just increased my frustration. There are even sections where enemies get guns and you're supposed to duck behind cover, which is a cool idea on paper. However, this game came out 3 years after Gears of War, and that cover system, even with its flaws, felt way more refined. Here it just feels very clunky. Now, I do want to give credit where credit's due. Visually, this game looks fantastic for something pushing 20 years old. It was actually the first video game to use a virtual camera system that let developers see character movements in real time while actors perform motion capture. All the human characters were actually based on mocap performances, and the non-human characters were the only ones animated by hand. And most Resident Evil games actually take place at night. This one, on the other hand, almost entirely during the day, which tells me that the development team had serious confidence in the visuals. You can hide imperfections in the darkness at night. You can't hide them in broad daylight. And they had every right to be confident in the visuals from this game. It looks incredible for a 20-year-old game. The voice acting, which again has been historically hit or miss in this franchise, is much improved here. Performances feel more grounded, with one notable exception, and that is Ricardo Irving. He might be one of the most annoying characters in the entire franchise.
Won't you two just die already? You're making me look bad. Who do you think got this entire operation off the ground? Research like this doesn't fund itself, you know. Yet everyone looks down on me. But not anymore.
I vaguely remember him in my first playthrough kind of only being in the game for about a third of it. And so while I was replaying this game, I was counting the seconds until his section was over, because again, so annoying. But at the end of the day, Resident Evil 5 is a fascinating entry. It's definitely not survival horror. It's not scary at all. It's an action-heavy co-op shooter wearing a Resident Evil skin. But to its credit, it's fast, it's polished, it looks great, it's ambitious, and when you play with a friend, it's a blast. Playing solo, on the other hand, just be ready for those Wesker fights to test your patience. All right, so going into the 9th game in this Resident Evil retrospective, the game I'm referring to is Resident Evil Revelations 2, which stars Claire Redfield, now a member of TerraSave, an anti-bioterrorism organization. Unfortunately, she, alongside other members, are kidnapped at a fundraiser and taken to a compound in the Baltic Sea. Claire, very skilled in breaking out of prison from her time during the events of Code Veronica, escapes her cell and rescues Moya Burton, the daughter of our buddy from RE1, Barry Burton. While trying to escape the island, the duo discover a sinister plot by the Overseer, which is later revealed to be Alex Wesker. More on that later, don't get too excited. 6 months later, Barry Burton tracks down the compound and is determined to save his daughter. And like the first Revelations game, Revelations 2 was one of the rare mainline Resident Evil games I'd never played before, which was honestly kind of nice this deep in the marathon to have a game that I had never played before. And like I said with the first Revelations game, its story definitely felt like a side story. Yeah, it was fun, but it was kind of off to the side and didn't feel as important to the overall franchise as some of these other games. Revelations 2 is still technically a side story, but it's way easier pill to swallow because of who's involved. We finally get Claire Redfield back as the main protagonist for the first time since Resident Evil Code Veronica, and that alone gives this game a lot of weight. But even bigger for longtime fans, Barry Burton is finally a fully playable story character in a mainline game. Sure, he helped you out in Resident Evil, but you couldn't actually play as him. Apparently, he also plays a role in the original Resident Evil 3. However, I only played the remake, so I never saw that version of him. Here, on the other hand, he is front and center. And honestly, Barry's campaign, even though his part is always second to Claire's, his campaign is definitely the emotional core of the entire game. Like the story in Revelations, this game's story is split into episodes. Each episode has a Claire section and a Barry section. You always play Claire's first, Barry's second, because Barry's story takes place 6 months later, which kind of sucks because he's exploring the same environments Claire already went through. So mechanically, that means you're retreading the same areas over and over again, and the environment definitely loses some of its impact the second time around. However, narratively, it works really well. Barry is searching for his daughter after losing his other daughter in a tragic accident. They do kind of peel back the layers on what happened in that accident as you go along in the game, and they really dig into his backstory and how his past has haunted him, especially as a father. It makes his sections feel way more grounded and personal, and as the game goes along, he ends up becoming a sort of father figure for Natalia, this young girl that he partners with early on in the game, and that dynamic is where this game really shines. It's emotional without being overly melodramatic, and it adds depth to a character unfortunately for years, has basically just been a side character. And as I mentioned in the synopsis, there is a Wesker in this game. No, she's not actually related to Albert Wesker. While the main antagonist does share the surname, it's more thematic than actual blood relations. Don't go into Revelations 2 expecting some huge lore bomb tied to the original Wesker. The episodic TV show format from the first Revelations game returns here, complete with the previously on style recaps. However, it does feel a little bit muted this time around. As I already mentioned, each episode alternates between Claire's timeline and Barry's timeline. Conceptually, that's really cool. In practice, revisiting the same environments twice hurts the pacing. The first time you explore an area, it's tense and atmospheric. The second time, you already know the layout and the fear factor definitely drops. There are multiple endings to Revelations 2, but basically each ending boils down to one particular pretty obvious choice near the end of the game. You will definitely know it when you see it. It's definitely not some complex branching narrative. Moving on to something that I didn't really expect with this game. I have been called a lot of things in my life conservative, especially with language. It has not been one of them. I curse a lot, probably too much. I probably have a lot in this video already, but even I was surprised by how much cursing there is in this game. Yes, this franchise has always had cursing. These characters are in horrifying, traumatic situations, and a little profanity makes sense, but here it just feels excessive, like they were trying a little too hard to make it gritty, and it just comes off as forced at times. One thing I really did like that they added to this particular game is the skill setting system. This game leans into some light RPG mechanics. You can earn points, unlock abilities, and tweak your characters. And like a lot of Resident Evil games, this one wants you to replay it. I beat the campaign and didn't even come close to unlocking all these skills. Therefore, this game is built for multiple runs, different difficulties, and kind of optimizing your build to your playstyle. I wouldn't necessarily call Revelations 2 a completionist dream, but there's definitely some replayability here. I should also give out this quick PSA. If you're buying this on Steam like I did, make sure you're actually buying the entire game. The way that they have it listed on Steam, what's called Resident Evil Revelations 2 is actually just episode 1. You still have to buy episodes 2 through 4 separately. There's also 2 additional episodes as DLC. However, for this marathon, I only played the main 4 episodes. I didn't dive into the extra story episodes, but I definitely plan to circle back because I did enjoy this story. Also, for anybody that plays a lot of games on Steam Deck like I do, Revelations isn't listed as verified on Steam Deck. That's a lie. I probably played 75% of this game on the handheld, and I didn't have a single issue, no crashes, no weird performance dips, nothing game breaking. So if you've been hesitant to pick this game up because of the lack of Steam Deck verification, you've got nothing to worry about. You're good. So where does Revelations 2 land for me? It's still a side story. It doesn't move the main saga forward in a massive way. way, but the return of Claire, the deep character work with Barry, the light RPG progression system, and the replayability all elevate it beyond feeling like filler. It's certainly not perfect. The reused environments hurt the pacing, the episodic gimmick feels toned down, and the dialogue can be aggressively edgy, but emotionally it hits harder than I expected, and therefore I'm always going to give a game a benefit of the doubt. If I relate to the characters, I'm definitely going to enjoy the game more than I expected. Alright, so let's talk about the black sheep of the mainline Resident Evil games. And the game I'm of course referring to is Resident Evil 6, which follows a new strand of the virus, which is released by the new evil corporation dubbed Neo Umbrella, led by someone impersonating Ada Wong. We'll get to that here in a little bit. Jake Muller, the son of Albert Wesker, is believed to be the key to the vaccine due to his relation to the late bioterrorist. Meanwhile, US President Adam Benford is ready to spill the beans about the Raccoon City incident and the government's dealings with Umbrella, but is infected with the virus before he can do so and must be put down by his loyal agent Leon S. Kennedy and Secret Service agent Helena Harper. The pair encounter the real Ada Wong, who tells them that National Security Advisor Derek Simmons is affiliated with Neo Umbrella and orchestrated the attack. That was quite the mouthful, but there's a reason for that, which we'll get to here in a second. And like I mentioned before we got into the synopsis, this is by far the consensus worst Resident Evil game. It's definitely the worst reviewed mainline Resident Evil game, and I remember playing it when it first came out and not loving it at the time, and I was really hoping that, especially considering I was playing all these games and this was going to be towards the back end of the marathon, that I was really hoping that when my mind would change after I did this replay. Unfortunately, that was not the case. From the jump, this game just doesn't feel like a Resident Evil game. One of the core pillars of this franchise, even when it leans into the action heavy stuff, which it definitely did with Resident Evil 5, is exploration. Figuring out where to go, solving puzzles, figuring out which key goes to which door, that slow burn tension of not knowing what's around the next corner. But in Resident Evil 6, you've got objective markers plastered on your screen the entire time. It's constantly telling you where to go. These games have always been linear, sure, but this one is absolutely on rails. There's zero exploration. And when the game is holding your hand every step of the way, it kind of sucks the fun out of it, especially with a Resident Evil game. And let's talk about the survival horror, or lack thereof, because there is practically no survival horror in Resident Evil 6. And again, Resident Evil 5 had already pretty much jumped the shark as far as the horror action mix. That game definitely leaned into the horror blockbuster than the previous entries. But you still had some small moments of horror with that game, and you also had Albert Wesker as the main villain, which made that shift easier to stomach. But one core feature of survival horror is resource management, and in Resident Evil 6 there's an abundance of resources. Ammo is everywhere, healing items are everywhere. A staple of survival horror is managing your bullets. That anxiety of, do I really want to waste this shotgun shell on this rando zombie? In Resident Evil 6, you never ever have to worry about running out of ammo, which takes part of the fun out of the game. Now, it's not all bad. I do want to point that out. There were things about this game that I did enjoy. First of all, the voice acting is incredible. They'd really kind of stepped up their game with Resident Evil 5 as far as the performances were concerned, and this game took it to a whole new level. You've got Roger Craig Smith returning as Chris, Matt Mercer as Leon, my boy Troy Baker as Jake, Laura Bailey as Helena. It's an absolutely stacked cast. The performances are legitimately great, no notes. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said about the campaign structure. This is where things get really messy for me. There are 4 campaigns all happening at the same time. Now, you can play them in any order, but the default order is Leon, Chris, Jake, and then Ada. And I personally would suggest, first of all, I would just play them in the default order, but I would also definitely suggest playing Ada last because it works best as kind of this redemption arc. Resident Evil 6 also went all in on the partner system. Each campaign character has their own individual partner, except for Ada, which we'll get to here in a second. Leon teams up with Helena. Chris is partnered with Pierce. Jake Muller, who is actually Wesker's son, is teamed up with Sherry Birkin, the little girl from Resident Evil 2, all grown up at this point. And Ada technically flies solo. However, if you're co-oping in this entire game, which is actually how I played it the first time around, she does get paired with a generic agent character. And this agent is so stupid. He can't open doors, he can't solve puzzles, he can't interact with key objects. If a cutscene happens or Ada uses her grappling hook, he just completely vanishes and then reappears next to her like nothing happened. It's super awkward. They literally just threw him in there. So for anyone that was co-oping this entire game, because there's partners for every other campaign, at least you could do it for Ada as well. But they didn't put any thought into her partner at all. Now, I am a big fan of when stories try to tell different perspectives. And so the idea behind 4 campaigns happening at the same time from different people's perspective does sound cool. It is ambitious. I do like the idea of interconnected stories. Resident Evil has always played with that. However, having the simultaneous campaigns just feels like it spreads the narrative way too thin. Big story moments feel like they're being held back because the game needs to stretch content across all 4 campaigns. Now, gameplay wise, each campaign does kind of have its own style. Leon's campaign feels the most like traditional Resident Evil, at least compared to the others. It's still very action heavy, obviously. Chris's campaign is a full-blown run-and-gun shooter with a cover system that honestly kind of sucks. It feels like they doubled down on the cover system from RE5, and that one was just flat-out garbage. Jake's campaign is somewhere in between, and Ada's campaign actually has the best puzzles in the game. So there were some flashes of classic Resident Evil sprinkled in this game. There's also an upgrade system. It's not the same RPG light skill system that I loved in Revelations 2, but you can unlock new abilities and upgrades, which is cool. I'll definitely give them that positive. But man, it's quickly ruined by all of the quick time events in this game. I hate QTEs, and this game is littered with them. It drove me insane. And then there's the action. Leon is roundhouse kicking zombies, suplexing dudes. At one point, you're fighting BOWs that are literally half man, half grasshopper with machine guns. I'm not exaggerating. It's absolutely batshit absurd. To be honest, if you like over-the-top action set pieces, you'll probably have a blast with this game. There are explosions, collapsing buildings, helicopter crashes. It goes full blockbuster mode. But if you're coming in expecting a true to form Resident Evil experience, you're going to be very disappointed. I don't actually think Resident Evil 6 is a terrible game in a vacuum. If you turn your brain off and accept it as a dumb, chaotic action shooter, there's fun to be had for sure. The production value is high, the voice cast is great, the combat can be flashy and entertaining, but as a Resident Evil game, it certainly misses the mark. There's no tension, there's no meaningful resource management, there's no real exploration, just constant forward momentum and objective markers telling you exactly where to go. So yeah, it is the worst reviewed mainline Resident Evil game, and I totally understand why. All that being said, I'm glad I replayed it, because even when this franchise stumbles, it's fascinating to see how far it's willing to push itself before course correcting. And after this one, we are thankfully headed into the last 2 games of this marathon, and we're also heading into a much needed tonal shift. Speaking of that tonal shift, the game I'm referring to, of course, is the next game in our Resident Evil marathon, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. And this game shifts its focus from the usual cast of characters to Ethan Winters, who travels down to Louisiana to search for his missing wife, Mia. He finds her imprisoned by a psychotic Baker family that is infected by a fungal virus called the mold. And after the absolute action spectacle that was RE6, Capcom could have easily doubled down. RE6 was commercially successful. It sold a lot of copies, and I give them a lot of credit because they could have easily just kept pumping out these big explosive co-op action blockbusters. But instead, they took a massive creative swing with Resident Evil 7. They pivoted hard. They stripped things back. They stepped away from globe-trotting, bioterror, chaos, and focused on something way more intimate, way more personal, way more horrifying. It felt like survival horror was finally back on the menu, boys. Resident Evil 7 feels like a direct apology letter to longtime fans of Resident Evil, the franchise that literally defined survival horror as a genre. Limited ammo, claustrophobic spaces, inventory management, puzzle keys for weirdly shaped doors, all that classic stuff is here. Even Ethan, the main protagonist, has a block mechanic, which honestly feels weird at first, but the game clearly knows you're going to be hurting for ammo, so sometimes blocking and surviving and just trying to get past the enemy is smarter than actually shooting and killing the enemy. That design philosophy feels like old school Resident Evil thinking. And I haven't even touched on the biggest change of this franchise, and that is the fact that RE7 changes its perspective from third person to first person. This was actually the first mainline Resident Evil game to go fully first person. And wow, that perspective shift makes everything more intense, more immersive, more just scary. This is actually only the third time I've ever played Resident Evil 7 and only the second time I've actually beaten it. And that's not because it's bad. It's because this game freaks me out. And I'm a big horror fan. I do not scare easy. I seek this stuff out. So when I say this is easily the scariest game in the franchise, and honestly, one of, if not the scariest games of all time, that is saying a lot. There are a couple of solid jump scares, sure, but Resident Evil 7 mostly relies on atmosphere, that constant feel of dread, that feeling that something is wrong and that you are not safe is always present in Resident Evil 7. The Baker house is disgusting in the most impressively detailed way imaginable. This was the first full-length Resident Evil game running on Capcom's RE engine, and it shows. The lighting, the textures, the grim, it's grossly beautiful. The food is rotten, the walls are moldy, everything looks damp and infectious. I feel like I need a tetanus shot just from playing it. The molded enemies actually remind me a lot of the Leechmen from Resident Evil 0, and you know how much I hated those guys. Luckily, we don't need Molotov cocktails to kill the molded. However, they are very creepy, they hit hard. All that being said, I wish there were a few more enemy types to round things out. The variety does feel a little thin in this game. Now let's talk about the Bakers. Jack Baker is phenomenal. The voice performance, especially the voice performance, is fantastic. He's not quite the unstoppable force that Mr. X is in Resident Evil 2, and he's not quite on the same theatrical level as Lady D from Resident Evil Village that we'll talk about here in a second, but he's pretty damn close. When he's stomping around that house looking for you is pure anxiety. Lucas, on the other hand, his son, feels like Jigsaw dropped in Resident Evil. His sections definitely scratch that old school puzzle itch. And surprisingly, Mia's playable section was awesome. I've been pretty vocal in past reviews about not loving some of the secondary playable sections like Sherry in RE2 Remake or Ashley in the RE4 Remake, but Mia's segment actually works. It adds tension, expands the story, and most importantly, ties the game back into the larger Resident Evil universe. Because yes, while RE7 feels isolated and intimate, it absolutely exists within the RE canon. If you're paying attention, there are a lot of winks and nods as you go along in this game, but of course, our old friend Chris Redfield shows up as well. We also see the return of Umbrella under a new blue logo, suggesting the company is actually trying to atone for its past. It's a subtle but important bridge back to the larger franchise mythology. Now, we do have to talk about Ethan. Like I said earlier, overall, I think the voice cast does a great job, especially Jack. But Ethan Winters, he's kind of a blank slate. He doesn't really show a ton of emotion. The dude literally gets a knife shoved through his hand and he barely reacts. He has almost no personality. I get that they're kind of going for player immersion, especially considering this game apparently is very cool on VR. But sometimes I just wanted a little bit more humanity and personality from him. And while I do think this game looks amazing, like I said, the RE engine definitely worked to this game's favor. Mia's hair looks insane in this game, and I don't mean that in a good way. However, my biggest complaint though is the length. This game is pretty short. It's not quite RE3 Remake short, but it is pretty short. However, if it wasn't so terrifying, I actually do think that that would make it incredibly replayable, kind of like Resident Evil Village, which I found myself running back pretty easily. But again, we'll get to that here in a little bit. But RE7 is so oppressive and uncomfortable that it almost discourages casual replays, which is weirdly a compliment. And from what I understand, this game is awesome to play on VR. I can't imagine it is, because I think it would be terrifying on VR, but this game almost makes me want to take the plunge just to experience it that way, because if the standard version already makes me uneasy, I can't imagine what that house feels like in full VR. But I can't say enough good things about Resident Evil 7. It was a bold, risky reset for the franchise, and for me, it totally paid off. It reminded everyone what makes this series special in the first place. It's intimate, it's gross, it's intense, it's terrifying. And after the bombastic excesses of RE6, Resident Evil 7 was exactly what the franchise needed. Alright, so we did it. After replaying every single mainline Resident Evil game in this marathon, we finally officially reached the final stop. And let's be real, I know this is not going to be a popular opinion, but it is my favorite Resident Evil game, and that is Resident Evil 8 Village. 3 years after the events of Resident Evil 7, Ethan is living with his wife Mia and 6-year-old daughter Rosemary in Eastern Europe when Chris Redfield and his Hound Wolf squad, which, let's be honest, stupid name for a squad of soldiers, break down their door, murder Mia, and kidnap Ethan and Rosemary. While Ethan and Rose are being transported, the van is involved in an accident, leaving Ethan stranded outside a village with Rose nowhere to be found. Ethan has to traverse the village to rescue Rosemary. The village is inhabited by werewolf-like mutants called Lycans and governed by 4 different mutant lords from strongholds within the village. And I absolutely adore this game. I know that might rub some hardcore Resident Evil fans the wrong way. I know this kinda starts to lean back into action. I know it gets goofy, but for me, this isn't just my favorite Resident Evil game of all time. It is in my top 10 favorite games of all time. The best way I can describe Village is it feels like Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 4 had a baby. You get that first-person immersion and grounded horror from RE7, but you also get that gothic atmosphere, eccentric villains, and escalating action of RE4. And that combo just works for me. This game checks literally every Resident Evil box. The opening pre-castle segment in the village is straight up survival horror, dark woods, snow everywhere, which, by the way, obviously this plays a huge part in it. I love the aesthetics of snow, so that definitely does it for me. And I'll be up front, I love werewolves, I love Lycans, I'm a sucker for that kind of stuff, and their creature design in this game is fantastic. They're aggressive, unpredictable, they kind of bob and sway very similar to how the RE2 zombies did, making them harder to shoot than you would expect. And I love that they're way more intense than your average zombie encounter. And then of course you hit the castle, and oh man, the gothic castle setting is top tier Resident Evil. Creepy corridor, weird key puzzles, locked doors everywhere. That slow, methodical exploration that makes classic RE so satisfying. And of course, Lady D is there. She's easily the second best stalker in the entire franchise, only behind Mr. X, and that is elite company. Massive credit needs to go out to Maggie Robertson for absolutely crushing that performance. She brings so much presence to that role. It's honestly a shame that we only get Lady D for the castle segment, because she could have carried even more of this game and I would have dug it. Then we get to the dollhouse, which might be one of the scariest sections in the entire franchise. No weapons, no safety net, just you and that mutant baby. That sequence is horrifying. The sound design alone is nightmare fuel. And then if you play the Shadows of Rose DLC, which I very much recommend, they even top the mutant baby by being chased by these creepy mannequins. By the way, the DLC also adds third-person mode for the main game, which is really cool. And apparently the upcoming RE9 is giving players that option from the start, which honestly feels like best of both worlds. Let's talk about bosses. Monroe is over the top and gross. Heisenberg is absolutely unhinged, and I love it. As I've talked about in this entire video, part of RE's charm has always been that layer of cheese baked into these games, and Village definitely embraces it. Heisenberg's factory section is probably the most divisive part of the game. It's a maze. No matter how many times I replay this game, I still get a little turned around in it, but I can't deny how cool it looks, and the voice performance from Neil Newbin is fantastic. He absolutely kills it as Heisenberg. And one of my favorite design choices in Village is how the map slowly opens up over time. As you go along in this game, more and more of the village gets opened up to you. You can revisit certain areas, unlock new paths, find new keys that lets you access areas you couldn't reach before. It gives that game that slight Metroidvania feel that old school Resident Evil thrived on. It makes the village itself feel cohesive and alive instead of just a backdrop. Now, it's not a perfect game by any means. I will admit I'm not the biggest fan of Chris's section. It leans hard into that first-person shooter territory, which makes sense with the character because his sections, especially RE5, really lean into the action-adventure, and this is no different. It feels more like a military action game than survival horror. That said, it's pretty short. It definitely doesn't overstay its welcome. It moves fast, and before you know it, you're back in the main storyline. Now, Ethan as a protagonist, I did have my issues with him in RE7. I still don't think he's the most charismatic character in the franchise. He definitely gets overshadowed by the massive personalities around him in this game, and to a certain extent in RE7 as well. But his voice performance is stronger here than it was in the previous game. He feels more present. He even has a couple of classic cheesy one-liners, which is basically a Resident Evil requirement at this point. And the big reveal at the end ties up some of the sillier loose ends from RE7 in a way that I actually appreciated. It recontextualizes things without completely breaking the lore. And visually, like RE7, this game looks incredible. Capcom continues to absolutely kill it with the RE engine. The castle design alone is some of the best environmental work in the franchise. And yes, they even brought back typewriters for saving, the first time since RE4. No ink ribbons required, thankfully. And the cherry on top is the Duke is such a cool character. I know people love the merchant from RE4, and I agree, that is a very cool character, but I certainly prefer the Duke in RE8. And as the final game in my Resident Evil marathon, this was a perfect way to end it. It's scary, it's goofy, it's action-packed for short segments. It has stalker enemies, weird puzzles, over-the-top villains, and some genuine survival horror sections. It checks every box for me. This is a game that I find myself playing and replaying, and it was something that I was really looking forward to in this marathon, and it didn't disappoint. I know it's not everyone's favorite, but for me, Resident Evil Village isn't just a great Resident Evil game, it's one of my favorite games ever made. And after replaying the entire mainline series, I can confidently say Capcom stuck the landing. Now we only have to wait a couple more days for RE9. All right, so that was a massive video. I'm glad that I'm done with it. I hope that you enjoyed it. It's been such a big part of my life the last couple of months. If you haven't already, I definitely appreciate it if you smash that like button. If you haven't considered subscribing yet, definitely do that. If you do subscribe, ding that bell. That way you get notified every time I post another video. I also will be streaming Resident Evil 9 when it comes out. I've already asked off for that day off from work. I'll be streaming most of the weekend for Resident Evil 9. I'll probably be putting out some form of video revolving around that particular game as well, sometime probably early next week. So if you like that, which you obviously do like that type of content, definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. But until next video, take it easy, guys. What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this is my boy Yoshi, aka Kitty Boy, and we were just talking and we agree that since you made it this far in the video, you might as well subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Kitty Boy, would you?